When it comes to predicting the presidential election, many people tend to take different approaches. Some people, like Nate Silver, utilize the polls to predict the outcome. Others, like Alan Lichtman, ignore polling entirely and focus on the general state of the incumbent administration as a whole through its 13-key system. As someone who is deeply invested within this latest election cycle, I think it would be interesting if I threw my hat in the ring. Instead of utilizing polls or interpreting the performance of the Biden administration, I think it's best to focus on one of the more intriguing components of this election: demographics. The reason I think it's an important aspect to focus on is because of the Electoral College. Although polls and the key system are insightful at predicting the popular vote, they tend to ignore the way in which individual states are shifting. For example, the keys failed to predict 2000 correctly because of how unappealing Al Gore was to coal miners across Appalachia and the Deep South. Similarly, polls failed to predict 2016 correctly because of Donald Trump's unique appeal to blue-collar workers across the Midwest. This is why I believe that it is important to look at not only how the country as a whole intends to vote, but how individual groups vote as well. In this video, we're going to take a look into each and every state and why they are expected to vote the way that they will in this upcoming election. There are some states that just aren't worth talking about, not because they aren't demographically uninteresting, but because they tend to vote overwhelmingly for one party. These are called safe states. For the sake of simplicity, I'll consider any state that is forecasted to vote for one candidate by 12 points or more safe. Despite their overall lack of relevance to this election, I would like to briefly discuss each one in one sentence or less. However, I do have two states in mind that I believe are worth discussing in further detail later in this video. Make sure to pause to see the results of your home state when it pops up on screen. Southern whites and low post-secondary education rates. Southern whites and low post-secondary education rates. Overwhelming diversity and loose voter restriction laws. High post-secondary education rates in close proximity to two major metropolitan areas. High post-secondary education rate close proximity to two major metropolitan areas. High post-secondary education rates and overwhelmingly diversity. High presence of Asian Americans. Relatively sparse population and socially conservative Mormons. The Chicago area. Strong presence of blue-collar workers in more conservative cities. Mostly sparse population with socially conservative farmers. It's Appalachia. Southern whites and low post-secondary education rates. High post-secondary education rates in close proximity to two major metropolitan areas. High post-secondary education rates with the socially liberal electorate. Southern whites and low post-secondary education rates. Let's be honest, this whole state's a gerrymander. Mostly sparse population with socially conservative farmers. Mostly sparse population with socially conservative farmers. High post-secondary education rates in close proximity to two major metropolitan areas. Mostly sparse population with socially conservative oil rig workers. Mostly sparse population with socially conservative oil rig workers and farmers. A socially liberal electorate. Close proximity to two major metropolitan areas. Southern whites. Mostly sparse population with socially conservative farmers. Southern whites and Appalachian coal miners. Relatively sparse population and socially conservative Mormons. Extremely socially liberal electorate with high post-secondary education rates. Socially liberal with high post-secondary education rates. It's Appalachia. Mostly sparse population with socially conservative farmers. With that out of the way, here are the two states that I intentionally skipped over. The reasoning for this is that there are some people out there who believe that these are swing states, and I need to set the record straight that they definitely aren't. Some of you might be scratching your heads at this choice, but some people truly believe that New York could become competitive this election cycle. This is because of Lee Zeldin's astounding performance in the 2022 gubernatorial, as well as the 4 House pickups Republicans received from the state. Although these are very impressive margins for Republicans to pull off, I do not believe that this will translate to the national level. Donald Trump is definitely someone who has helped make the state more red. However, New York City remains as an extremely powerful Democratic stronghold. Even if Trump is able to gain slightly among minority and religious groups, that's still around 60 to 70% of them voting for Kamala Harris. At best, he can crack the 40% threshold, though that would require a bit more time than it's worth campaigning there. My prediction for the state is that Kamala Harris will carry the state by roughly 20 points. She will lose ground in the upstate and parts of Long Island, but still hold on to New York City as well as most of the major Democratic strongholds. The This state used to be widely known as a swing state. Both in 2000 and 2004, over 50% of the electorate voted for Bush. Even during the Obama era, Republicans were able to keep the state relatively competitive, most notably when Cory Gardner was able to defeat incumbent Senator Mark Udall in 2014. However, when Donald Trump began to run for office in the national level, the state began to rapidly trend leftward. Many of his overall brash and demeaning comments didn't sit right with a great deal of the traditional conservative base. Additionally, the state had always been one of the more socially liberal swing states. For example, it was the first state to legalize recreational cannabis in 2012. With the Republican Party becoming far more of a socially conservative party rather than a fiscal one, the overall electorate of the state has become incompatible with them. Therefore, it seems that Colorado will be voting with a safe Democrat margin for the foreseeable future. My prediction is a 17-point win for Kamala Harris in the state. She will continue to garner votes within the western ski resort towns as well as the Denver metro. Although I do not expect her to win the Republican strongholds of Douglas County or Colorado Springs, she will certainly make gains in those areas. Next up are the likely states. These states are ones that may be a little competitive, but very unlikely to flip. These states are pretty much locked down unless there's either an overly charismatic candidate, like Obama in 2008, or a widely unpopular candidate, like Goldwater in 1964. However, I do think they are worth mentioning for two reasons. Number one, there's the possibility that they could become competitive in future elections, and number two, they tend to be more competitive at the local level. For the sake of the video, I'm going to say the likely states are going to be within 5 to 12 points of flipping. The first likely state's Alaska. The reasoning behind why I don't believe the state will fall back into Donald Trump's safe column is because of one simple reason: the cities. Alaska is one of those rare states where the cities end up being more conservative than the rural areas. This primarily has to do with both the high indigenous and Asian American populations within these areas. However, the cities of Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau have been trending leftward over the past two election cycles. Therefore, I do think the state will continue its gradual trend leftwards. And yes, I am aware about Mary Pelota's upset win back in 2022. Her performance was really impressive. However, she's extremely moderate on most issues and is even one of the few Democrats who is endorsed by the NRA. If Democrats want a shot at winning the state, then they have to pursue a major platform shift. I do think that the state will be won again by Donald Trump with a healthy 10-point lead. However, I do believe that he will continue to lose ground in almost every area as the state has continued to trend more socially liberal. This state is quite the anomaly. For the longest time, Florida has been known as the most important swing state. However, in 2020, one of the most significant shifts happened. Both Miami-Dade and Seminole counties swung drastically towards the right. This is because of the high presence of Hispanic Americans, particularly Cuban and Venezuelans. Although these voter groups used to vote overwhelmingly blue, recent shifts in both South Texas and Florida have proven that this group has rapidly shifted to the right. Furthermore, both Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio were able to win the state by well over double digits in the 2022 midterm. Therefore, it's safe to assume that the momentum will continue in the state of Florida and Trump will gain massive numbers. I'm predicting that Trump will win the state by a likely margin of a little under 9 points. Less than the 2022 win, it's still a massive gain for Republicans. I don't think it's worth it to talk about this state too much. This state has both a high blue-collar population as well as a rural population. It is really no surprise to see how much the state has trended rightward. Donald Trump's appeal to white working-class voters has completely changed the political landscape of the Midwest from a previously blue stronghold to a Republican-leaning one. My prediction is that Trump will continue to gain support among this population. He will gain more support in the rural areas, however, he might lose a slight amount of support in the Des Moines suburbs and college towns. This should result in a win of roughly 10 points. This is one of those states that both presidential campaigns have begun to pay attention to closely. Not only because of Maine's 2nd congressional district, but the state as a whole has swung vastly to the right. This is because of Maine's higher blue-collar population that most of the other New England states lack. I know the state does split electoral votes, but I don't think it's worth it trying to do the math for congressional delegation. I think Harris will win the state by close to 7 points, which is far better than Hillary Clinton's abysmal performance of 3 points in 2016, but less than Biden's in 2020. Ah yes, the state I grew up in. This is a state that Republicans have made significant gains in, particularly in the rural areas. The most notable example of this is when Trump unexpectedly came within striking distance of Hillary Clinton, only trailing her by around 1.5 points. Now, some people may be inclined to believe that Tim Walz might help Harris's margin in the state, but I beg to differ. In the 2022 Minnesota gubernatorial election, Tim Walz lost significant amounts of support outside of the Twin Cities metro. Additionally, both the state auditor and attorney general election in the state were extremely close. It does seem that there is a growing dissatisfaction of the present leadership across the state, at least in the rural areas. Although I do not think Harris will lose this state, I think Trump will keep it close enough for her to only win by a 5-point margin. I'm expecting Harris to make gains in the Twin Cities metro, but also lose ground in rural counties across the rest of the state. This state, much like Alaska, is one of the more socially liberal, economically conservative states in the US. This has resulted in the state trending increasingly to the left throughout the past few election cycles. However, Republicans have been able to keep the state relatively close, most notably in 2016 when Trump lost to Hillary Clinton in the state by only a few thousand votes. However, due to the state's overall high education rate and more socially liberal values, it does seem that the state is unlikely to fall back into Trump's column. I think Harris is going to win the state by around 6 points. Trump may do slightly better in the rural areas, but overall it seems unlikely that the state will get competitive this election cycle. This is a very bizarre state when it comes to presidential election. Yes, the state has been relatively favorable for Democrats since 2008, but as I mentioned earlier, Trump has a fairly decent appeal to Latino voters that can help him out slightly more in the state. However, the more educated base in the northern part of the state has counteracted Trump from making any significant gains. I'm predicting an 8-point win for Harris in the state. Slight gains are expected between both candidates overall. Trump will do better in the more rural Hispanic southern part of the state, and Harris will do better in the more educated northern part of the state. Much like Iowa and Florida, this is a former swing state that has heavily trended into Trump's column as of recent. It does seem like the momentum, particularly among socially conservative blue-collar workers, has not waned in the slightest. In fact, I believe that this state will swing even further to the right. Not only because J.D. Vance is on the ticket, but also the increasing anti-mass immigration sentiment in the state. With Trump winning over the Cleveland suburbs in 2020 as well as Mahoning County, it seems clear to everyone that the state may become completely out of reach for Democrats in the near future, at least on the presidential level. I'm predicting a strong 9 to 10 point lead for Donald Trump in the Buckeye State. However, he could easily crack the 10-point threshold this election cycle. This is a state that Democrats have heavily been banking on becoming blue as of recent. In 2018, Ted Cruz nearly lost his seat to the fairly progressive candidate Beto O'Rourke. Additionally, Texas has become one of the fastest growing states in the country, with people moving there from heavily Democratic states such as New York and California. However, I do not believe in the doctrine of Blue Texas. While it is true that many of the metro areas in the Texas Triangle have moved heavily these past few election cycles, there's one major issue. As I mentioned before in the Florida segment and the New Mexico segment, the Hispanic population has trended heavily to the right as of recent. Some of these trends in South Texas are even more staggering than the ones in South Florida, with near 50-point swings in some counties. Even more significantly, the 2022 midterms have also remained relatively favorable for Republicans. Greg Abbott, for example, was able to maintain both a 10-point lead against Beto and also hold on to the Hispanic coalition Trump yielded 2 years prior. Therefore, I think Blue Texas is not only implausible, but the state as a whole will swing slightly to the right. After all, Hispanics make up nearly 40% of the state's population. My prediction is that Trump will win by roughly 7 points. He will continue to make significant gains in the southern part of the state. However, he will also fall short in the Texas Triangle suburbs, as those areas have continued to move to the left. This state has definitely been in the talks as of recent. Although Biden pulled a 10-point victory out of the state in 2020, a massive upset happened just 1 year later. Glenn Youngkin, fairly conservative Republican, won the governor's race. This is significant because that is a shift of nearly 12 points within just 1 year. This has resulted in many conservatives believing that the state is up for grabs. However, the issue with this notion is that Donald Trump is on the ballot. If there's one voter group that Donald Trump's particularly bad at winning over, it's educated voters. Due to the close proximity the state has to Washington, D.C., the state's post-secondary education rivals many northeastern states. Therefore, I do not believe Virginia will be competitive. However, the Youngkin coalition has certainly left a mark on the state. Although Youngkin himself is more moderate on some issues, he is pro-Donald Trump. I do believe that there will be some rightward trend in the state, particularly among more socially conservative parents. Therefore, I'm giving Harris a 7 to 8 point victory in the state. She will continue to hold on to the blue coalitions in the northern and central part of the state, but lose a slight amount of support in the Richmond suburbs, the 757 suburbs, and the Mountain West. Finally, we've arrived Big 7. These are the states that everyone is talking about. Poll numbers have constantly flipped back and forth throughout this election cycle across all of these states, and both candidates have spent copious amounts of money in order to hopefully win over voters this election. Although some people would like to believe that all of these states would vote together, I strongly disagree with this stance. These states are demographically different from one another in a lot of ways. Therefore, these states, although close in margin, will vote differently from one another. In this final segment, I would like to analyze each state with increasingly close margins purely for dramatic effect. Although there have been hopes among Democrats to flip the state over the years, it seems nearly impossible. Since 2008, the Democrat Party has poured millions of dollars into the state in a futile attempt to see an Obama-style win again. There are two main issues to this. Number one, the state has an extremely high rural population. In fact, it's the highest in the entire nation. And number two, the state is extremely religious. These two statistics generally favor the Republican Party. Therefore, although close, I do believe Donald Trump will win the state. I'll give him roughly a 2-point lead, with him gaining support in the rural areas, but losing some ground in the Research Triangle in Charlotte. Similar case to North Carolina, however, I see the state potentially voting to the right of its northern neighbor. Well, yes, the Atlanta metro does weigh heavy on the state still has a heavy rural population. Additionally, the state is also heavily religious, much like North Carolina, with 2/3 of the adults considering themselves to be heavily religious. I'll even go as far as to say Biden winning Georgia in 2020 was a fluke, much like Indiana in 2008. I absolutely do see the possibility of the state swinging several points to the right. However, I decided to play it safe and believe that Trump will only squeak by in the state. Yes, the midterms do appear promising for him. However, Brian Kemp isn't exactly the most hardcore Republican out there. Therefore, I'm predicting around a 2-point win for Donald Trump, similar to North Carolina. I expect Harris to perform just as well as Biden did in 2020 in the Atlanta metro, but lose ground in the central and southern parts of the state. This is one of the more interesting states because a lot of conservatives believe that this state is likely to flip, and the polling does kind of support that. Yes, Trump did narrowly win the state in 2016 by a few thousand votes. However, Biden was able to pull the state over to a lean margin in 2020. Additionally, pretty much all the statewide elections during the 2022 midterms were won by Democrats. In a supposedly red wave year, this is a very abysmal performance for the Republican Party. However, there is some slight optimism among the Republican base in the state. For starters, the mayor of Hamtramck, a Democrat, endorsed Donald Trump. This is significant because Hamtramck is the only Muslim-majority city in the entire U.S. Therefore, Donald Trump could reel in more socially conservative minority voters across the state. However, even with this slight boost, Muslims still make up a tiny percentage of the state's population. I'm thinking Kamala Harris will win Michigan by a little over a point. She'll do worse in most rural counties, but will still hold on to most of the major metropolitan areas for a narrow victory. Yes, I am fully aware of the polling from the state. Yes, I am aware of the Hispanic trend in the state. However, there's one major problem. The 2022 gubernatorial election. In this race, Republican candidate Kari Lake pulled decently ahead of Katie Hobbs leading up to the election. Furthermore, Hobbs refused to ever even directly debate Lake. It seemed clear from both the polling numbers and the mainstream media that Kari Lake was going to be Arizona's next governor. But to everyone's shock, that did not happen. It seems clear to everyone that Arizona is becoming an increasingly liberal state, not only from increased amounts of immigration from foreign countries, but also people moving in from liberal states such as California and Washington. The reason I'm bringing up is that both Kari Lake and Donald Trump's political positions are nearly identical, particularly when it comes to immigration. This state clearly rejected what would have been a MAGA governor, making it clear that Arizona will continue to reject Trumpianism for the foreseeable future. My personal assessment is that Harris will narrowly win the state by around a point, with increased percentage gains in Maricopa County. Much like North Carolina, many pundits over the years have believed that this state could potentially flip. To their credit, they have fairly good reason to believe this notion. In 2022, fairly popular Senator Catherine Cortez Masto nearly lost her election. Additionally, incumbent Governor Steve Sisolak lost his race to Joey Lombardo. It does seem to both Nevada's high working class population and Hispanic shifts that this state will flip, right? Although that is a pretty reasonable assumption, I disagree with this notion. First off, Steve Sisolak was a fairly unpopular governor, having one of the lowest approval ratings in the nation. Furthermore, Joey Lombardo isn't exactly the most socially conservative governor. In fact, he has moderate to liberal views on abortion and mostly focuses on fiscal conservative policies instead. Although Donald Trump also is moderate on certain issues, his rhetoric tends to only highlight his more radical stances. Therefore, although it is possible I could be wrong, I do not expect Nevada to flip this election. I do think the state will swing to the right given the Hispanic trends. However, I doubt Trump's going to be able to win the state as a whole. My prediction is a narrow win for Kamala Harris in the Silver State. She will lose ground in pretty much every county, but hold on to the Democratic cities of Reno and Las Vegas just enough to win. Now, a lot of people might think the state will go to the Democratic column. After all, the polling numbers are in their favor and Ron Johnson nearly got unseated in the 2022 midterms. However, I do not believe Harris will win the state. Yes, the state does tend to lean Democratic in most elections, but there is one slight problem with the state. The main issue that Wisconsin has is that Republicans tend to be significantly underestimating the polling numbers. Additionally, the state has very red urban populations such as the Wow counties, the southern Milwaukee suburbs, and the Green Bay area. Although Democrats have gained significantly in other suburban counties across the nation, they have struggled to gain any substantial support in these regions. In fact, these regions used to be fairly Democratic prior to 2016. Therefore, I believe Wisconsin will narrowly go to Donald Trump by around half a point. I can understand why a lot of people would strongly disagree, but Wisconsin is definitely the most Republican state in the upper Midwest. This is the state that everyone is expecting to be the tipping point, including myself. Pennsylvania. This state had been both incredibly close in 2016 and 2020, with both Democrats and Republicans alike pouring millions of dollars into the Keystone State. In the East, there are higher educated white-collar workers who reside within the Philadelphia suburbs. In the West, there are less educated blue-collar workers who tend to favor both a socially conservative and larger government. These are the reason why these workers overwhelmingly defected to Trump in 2016, despite mostly voting Democrat in previous election cycles. Trump is able to massively appeal to the union workers who want better wages and the ability to keep their jobs. These two opposing forces have made roughly even numbers in the state. However, with Trump not having exactly an astounding record with the unions, it does seem to put him at a disadvantage in the state. Additionally, in 2022, the state overwhelmingly voted for Democrats. Both Josh Shapiro and John Fetterman pulled off astounding victories in the state, both of whom overperformed Joe Biden significantly. However, that could also be attributed to low Republican turnout across rural areas. Furthermore, 2022 Republican midterm candidates were extremely lackluster. Mehmet Oz is a generic TV show host who didn't even live in Pennsylvania until 2020. As for Doug Mastriano, he's a right-wing extremist who proposed both budget cuts to education, a statewide abortion ban, and was even present at the January 6th protests. Trump is a highly charismatic figure who is super effective at boasting rural turnout. Furthermore, Pennsylvania has quite a few conservative cities including Reading, Wilkes-Barre, and Lancaster. Therefore, this state will be the narrowest in this election. My final prediction is that Harris will narrowly win the state by less than half a point. My reasoning behind this is that Harris has been endorsed by the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO, the largest labor union in the state. That might not be significant, but in a race as close as this one, endorsements can go a long way. Now that the electoral votes are tallied up, we can apply that to my final map. And the final winner, with 277 electoral votes, is Vice President Kamala Harris. Although a very close election, I believe that she will narrowly prevail, becoming the first female president, the first female of color president, and the first Asian American president. However, her win will be one of the most narrow in American history, with only a 16 electoral vote difference between her and former President Donald Trump. Just to show you how close of a margin this is, the only two elections that were decided by a closer margin were the highly contested 1876 and 2000 elections, which to this day historians argue whether or not the results of these elections were even legitimate. To close off, I want to state this. No election prediction is ever going to be spot on. I cannot read the minds of every single person and figure out who they're voting for. I could wind up being completely wrong with this prediction, which is why I do not want you to take what I'm saying as reliable. This video is more so of a personal test to see how accurately I myself can predict a presidential election. As someone with personal biases, I've been both pleasantly and unpleasantly surprised by election outcomes in the past, which is why I want to take a completely new approach and remain as impartial as possible. This is my first ever election cycle trying to do this, meaning this prediction format has absolutely no track record and has hardly been tested. If you want to take one thing away from this video, it's this. With how polarized and competitive our political climate is, I want you to vote. I want you to vote for the person you believe that will be best not only for you, but the entire country as a whole. Nearly every single election since 2000 has been decided by just a few thousand votes, which has drastically altered the course of modern history. Not only does this apply to federal elections, but state-level ones as well. So please, by any possible means you can, vote. The fate of this country is in your hands.
I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. This entire project took roughly about a year to complete. I started with early concepts all the way back in November of 2023, and I finally got around to finishing it, so thank you so much, and I hope that you enjoyed the video here. For now on, I probably won't be doing any type of content like this until the 2026 midterms roll around, so if you do want to check out election content, unfortunately this channel probably won't really be the place for that going forward. But I just wanted to do this as like a little thought experiment to myself, so thank you, and I'm glad that you enjoyed the video.